The courtroom buzzed with tension as the judge prepared to deliver the final verdict. A case that had divided the town, one that could ruin a man's life, hung in the balance. Just as the gavel was about to strike, a low growl echoed through the hall. Heads turned. Gasps filled the room. A scruffy stray dog, mud-caked and battle-worn, limped toward the judge's bench, something clutched in its jaws. The judge squinted as the dog dropped it at his feet, a tattered piece of evidence no one had seen before. And in that moment, everything changed. The courtroom buzzed with restless murmurs. The air was thick with tension as James Carter sat rigid in his chair, his fingers curled into a tight fist on the defense table. He had been a police officer for 10 years, upholding the law, saving lives. Yet today, he was the one in handcuffs. The prosecution had painted him as a murderer, a man who had snapped under pressure and taken a life in cold blood. The judge cleared her throat, and the murmurs died instantly. "Mr. Carter, please rise," she commanded. James stood slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs. His lawyer, Emily Lawson, whispered, "Stay strong," though even she looked worried. The jury had deliberated for hours. Now, they were ready to decide his fate. The judge nodded at the bailiff, who prepared to read the verdict. But then, a sharp bark echoed through the courtroom. Heads turned. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A stray dog, matted for clinging to its thin frame, limped through the heavy oak doors as if it had every right to be there. The bailiff moved to stop it, but the dog dodged, weaving through the pews. It didn't hesitate. It headed straight for James. The courtroom sat frozen in stunned silence as the dog stopped at his feet. Its amber eyes locked onto his, and then 3 sharp, deliberate barks. It was almost as if the dog was speaking. The judge frowned. "Whose dog is this?" No one answered. The prosecutor, Mr. Hastings, scoffed. "Your Honor, this is clearly a disruption. Let's proceed with the verdict." But before the judge could respond, the dog turned abruptly. It growled low and menacing at someone across the room. Daniel Price, the prosecution's star witness. Daniel stiffened, his face going pale. The dog bared its teeth, a deep growl rumbling from its throat. The room, which had been on the verge of laughter at the strange interruption, now grew deathly still. Emily sat up straighter, her lawyer's instincts firing. "Your Honor," she said quickly, "something about this isn't right. I request a recess to investigate." Hastings scoffed again. "Investigate what?" "A stray dog." But Emily wasn't looking at him. She was watching Daniel Price, who had begun sweating under the dog's unwavering stare. The judge sighed. 5-minute recess. Bailiff, remove the dog from a court. The bailiff hesitated before stepping forward. He reached down to grab the stray by the collar, only to freeze. There was no collar. And yet, when the bailiff gently nudged the dog, it didn't resist. It turned back to James, looking up at him with something that felt eerily like understanding. Then, as suddenly as it had arrived, the dog allowed itself to be let out. But James couldn't shake the feeling that it had just tried to tell him something. And judging by the way Daniel Price was shifting nervously in his seat, he wasn't the only one. Something had just changed. And James wasn't sure what, but for the first time since his arrest, he had hope. Because maybe, just maybe, the dog knew the truth. The courtroom was still buzzing with whispers long after the stray dog had been let out. The judge had called for a recess, but no one had moved. Something about that moment, those 3 deliberate barks, the dog's unwavering stare at Daniel Price, had unsettled everyone. James Carter sat back down, his mind racing. That dog hadn't just wandered in by accident. It had come straight to him, as if it knew him, as if it recognized something no one else had seen. And then there was Daniel Price, the way his face had gone pale, the nervous way he rubbed his hands together. Emily Lawson, his lawyer, leaned in. "Did you see Price?" He looked ready to bolt. James nodded. "That dog was after him, not me." Emily tapped a pen against the table, her sharp mind already working. "It's not just that." It barked 3 times, like it was calling something out. And then that growl, "Animals don't fake reactions, James." That was real. James sighed. "Yeah, But how does a stray dog prove I didn't commit murder? Emily didn't answer right away. Instead, she pulled out her phone and typed something in. I'm going to check something, she muttered. James watched as she scrolled through a local news site. Finally, she stopped, her eyes narrowing. She turned the screen toward him. It was a news article, dated just 3 months earlier. The headline made his stomach drop. Local man found dead near abandoned warehouse. Dog found beside the body. James grabbed the phone, scanning the article. The victim's name was Mark Hensley, the same man James had been accused of murdering. His breath caught as he reached the last line. Asterisk, witnesses reported a stray dog found at the scene, refusing to leave the victim's side. The dog fled before authorities arrived. Asterisk. James looked up at Emily. You think that was the same dog? Emily nodded. I don't believe in coincidences, James. A chill ran through him. He remembered the crime scene photos from his case file. The victim had been found in a dark alleyway near the old warehouses on 12th Street. The prosecution had claimed James was the last person seen near the area. But if the dog had been there too, what had it seen that night? Emily stood. We need to find that dog. James almost laughed. Find it? In this whole city. She smirked. It found you, didn't it? Maybe it'll do it again. Before James could answer, the bailiff returned. Recess is over. Back to your seats. James and Emily exchanged a glance. The dog had given them a clue, but would they have time to follow it? As the judge re-entered and the jury was called back in, one thing was clear. They had to work fast. Because if that dog really had the answers, then James Carter's fate rested on 4 paws and a wagging tail. James could barely focus as court resumed. His heart was still racing from what Emily had found. The stray dog wasn't just some random interruption. It had been there at the crime scene the night Mark Hensley died. But what did it know? What had it seen? The judge called for order as Daniel Price, the prosecution's star witness, took the stand again. James forced himself to listen. Mr. Price, the prosecutor, Hastings, began smoothly. Let's go over your testimony once more. You stated that on the night of September 14th, you saw the defendant near the crime scene, correct? Daniel nodded quickly. Yes, sir. I saw James Carter outside the warehouse, and then I heard a loud noise, like a struggle. When I went closer, I saw him running away. James clenched his jaw. Lies. He had never run. He had arrived after hearing a noise, just like Daniel claimed. But by the time he got there, Mark was already gone. Emily leaned toward him and whispered, Watch him. He's nervous. James did. Daniel's fingers tapped anxiously against the wooden stand. His eyes kept darting toward the doors, as if he expected something or someone to barge in. Or maybe some asterisk thing. Asterisk. And then, almost as if the universe had heard James's thoughts, it happened. The heavy courtroom doors creaked open. All heads turned. The stray dog was back. A stunned silence settled over the room as the dog limped forward, completely ignoring the bailiff moving toward it. It didn't hesitate, didn't falter. It went straight for Daniel Price. A deep, guttural growl rumbled from its chest. Daniel shifted in his seat, his fingers gripping the stand. The prosecutor cleared his throat. Someone remove that animal. But before anyone could move, Emily stood. Your Honor, I request that this dog remain. The judge blinked. Ms. Lawson, it's a stray. This is highly unorthodox. Emily nodded. I understand. But Your Honor, this dog was at the crime scene the night of the murder. And right now, it is reacting strongly to the prosecution's key witness. She turned, her sharp gaze locking onto Daniel. Why is that, Mr. Price? The color drained from Daniel's face. The judge exhaled. Ms. Lawson, are you implying? I'm implying that this dog recognizes him. Emily interrupted. And I want to know why. The entire courtroom held its breath. The dog didn't bark this time. It just stared at Daniel, its body tense, waiting. Daniel swallowed hard. His hands trembled slightly against the stand. I don't know what you mean. Emily stepped forward. I find that strange. Because we've just discovered that this dog was present the night Mark Hensley died. So I'll ask again, Mr. Price, why is it reacting this way to you? Daniel shifted uncomfortably. It's just a dog. It doesn't mean anything. But Emily wasn't done. Doesn't it? Because in my experience, animals don't lie. They don't fabricate stories. They recognize people they've seen before. So I'll ask one last time, under oath, why does this dog recognize you? The silence stretched unbearably long. Daniel's breath hitched. Then, the dog barked. Once, twice, 3 times. Just like before. And Daniel Price, the prosecution's key witness, the man whose testimony had sealed James's fate, looked ready to break. James held his breath, because at that moment he knew the truth was about to come out. The courtroom was so silent that James could hear his own heartbeat. Daniel Price's face was pale, his fingers tightening on the wooden stand, as if it were the only thing holding him upright. The stray dog stood motionless, its amber eyes locked onto him, waiting, just like everyone else in the room. The judge cleared her throat. Mr. Price, do you have an explanation for this? Daniel let out a shaky breath. It's just a coincidence. Dogs react to random things all the time. Emily wasn't buying it. She stepped forward, her sharp lawyer's instincts in full force. Then let's put that theory to the test. She turned to the bailiff. Can you bring the dog to the defendant? The bailiff hesitated before taking a slow step forward. The dog didn't resist, didn't growl. When it reached James, it simply wagged its tail and sat at his feet, calm and composed. Emily turned back to Daniel. Funny. No barking. No aggression. It seems to trust my client. She let the moment sink in before delivering her next words. So why doesn't it trust you? Daniel licked his lips, shifting uncomfortably. I don't know. Emily folded her arms. I think you do. The judge sighed. Ms. Lawson, unless you have evidence to support what you're implying. I do, Your Honor. Emily turned to the jury. My client was accused because of this man's testimony. Daniel Price claimed to have seen James Carter fleeing the scene of the crime. But now we have new information. This dog was at the crime scene too. And unlike Mr. Price, it doesn't lie. The prosecutor, Hastings, rolled his eyes. This is absurd. A dog is not a witness. Emily smirked. Not in the traditional sense, no. But evidence speaks. And I think this dog has seen more than we realize. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a small stack of papers. Your Honor, I have obtained security footage from a nearby street camera on the night of the crime. James's pulse quickened. He hadn't seen this footage before. Emily handed the papers to the judge. This footage was taken just a few minutes before the estimated time of death. It shows Mark Hensley leaving a bar on 12th Street and Daniel Price following him. The courtroom gasped. Hastings shot up. Objection. This proves nothing. Emily didn't flinch. It proves that Mr. Price was near the crime scene that night, which is more than he admitted under oath. She turned back to Daniel, her voice razor-sharp. Why were you following Mark Hensley? Daniel's mouth opened, but no words came out. Emily didn't let up. Let me guess. You knew Mark owed money, didn't you? A lot of money. And you needed him to pay up. Daniel finally snapped. That's not. Emily cut him off. Tell me something, Mr. Price. Did Mark Hensley ever pay you back? Or did something go wrong that night? The silence that followed was unbearable. Daniel looked around, searching for an escape. His face was slick with sweat. Then the dog barked again. Daniel flinched. His entire body tensed, like a man who knew the walls were closing in. James could feel it. The truth was right there, hanging in the air. One final push. Emily's voice was deadly calm. Mr. Price, were you there when Mark Hensley died? Daniel swallowed hard. Then, he bolted. Gasps erupted as Daniel jumped from a stand and sprinted for the door. The bailiff lunged after him, tackling him to the ground before he could escape. Papers scattered. Someone shouted for order. And just like that, everything changed. James sat frozen as the realization hit him. Daniel Price had just run, because he was guilty, and that meant James Carter was innocent. This chapter keeps the tension high while delivering a shocking turn of events. Let me know if you want any refinements or if I should continue with Chapter 5. The courtroom was chaos. Daniel Price thrashed against the bailiff's grip, his breath coming in panicked gasps as they wrestled him to the floor. The judge pounded her gavel, demanding order, but no one could look away. James Carter sat frozen, his mind racing to catch up with what had just happened. Daniel had run. The man who had testified against him, the man whose words had nearly sent him to prison, had run. And only guilty men run. Emily was already on her feet, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. Your Honor, I move for an immediate review of the case. Daniel Price's actions just now raised serious doubts about his testimony. The judge, still trying to regain control, held up a hand. Bailiff, remove Mr. Price and place him in custody for questioning. Daniel's face twisted in desperation. No, wait. This is a mistake. I was just scared. That dog, it's crazy. But the dog, still standing in the middle of the courtroom, didn't move. It simply stared at Daniel with those sharp, knowing eyes. And then it did something that sent chills down James's spine. It turned away from Daniel and looked at the prosecutor, Mr. Hastings. The silence that followed was suffocating. Emily saw it too. She frowned, then slowly turned toward Hastings. Mr. Hastings, she said carefully, you seem awfully quiet. The prosecutor forced a laugh, but there was something unnatural about it. This is ridiculous. We're not going to start taking legal advice from a stray mutt. But James wasn't convinced. Neither was Emily. No, she murmured, stepping closer. We're going to take advice from the facts. She turned back to Daniel, who was still trembling in the bailiff's grip. Tell us the truth, Daniel. Who were you covering for? Daniel clenched his jaw. He looked at the dog again, this time with something like fear. And then, in a broken whisper, he said, I never meant for this to happen. James's breath caught. Emily stepped in. For what to happen, Daniel? Daniel shut his eyes tightly, like a man about to rip off a bandage. Mark owed money, okay? To the wrong people. I was supposed to shake him down, just rough him up a little. But he fought back. His voice cracked. I wasn't the one who killed him. I swear. I was just supposed to scare him, but then Hastings showed up and... He stopped himself too late. The entire room went still. James barely heard his own whisper. Hastings. The prosecutor stiffened. Objection. This is hearsay. This man is a liar, a criminal, and he's only saying this to save himself. Emily pounced. A liar? Funny. You had no problem using his testimony to convict my client. The color drained from Hastings' face. This is absurd. Emily didn't let up. Not absurd, convenient. You built this entire case on Daniel's testimony, didn't you? Because you knew he was involved. You knew he'd say whatever you needed him to say. She took a step closer. Because you were there too. James's heart pounded. Could it be true? Had the man who tried to lock him away, who had fought so hard to bury him, been the real killer all along? The dog let out a low growl. Hastings shot up from his seat. This is outrageous. I refuse to sit here and listen to baseless. And then Daniel shouted, he did it. He's the one who finished Mark off. Gasps filled the room. Hastings's face twisted in fury. You little. Enough. The judge's voice boomed through the courtroom. She turned sharply to the bailiff. Take Mr. Hastings into custody. I want an immediate investigation into these claims. The prosecutor opened his mouth, then snapped it shut. He knew. It was over. The bailiff stepped forward, and Hastings didn't resist. As he was led away, he locked eyes with James. For the first time since the trial began, James saw fear in them. And just like that, the real culprit had been unmasked. James exhaled, his body sagging with the weight of it all. He was free. And it was all because of a stray dog that had walked into a courtroom and refused to let the truth stay buried. He looked down at the dog, the animal that had saved his life. It wagged its tail. For the first time in months, James smiled. But he wasn't done yet. Because if this dog had no owner, then it did now. To be continued. James Carter stepped out of the courthouse, inhaling deeply. The air tasted different, lighter, freer. For the first time in months, he wasn't carrying the crushing weight of a false conviction. He was a free man. Beside him, Emily adjusted her bag and grinned. That's the look of someone who just got their life back. James exhaled a short laugh. I still can't believe it. I thought my fate was sealed. But then he looked down at the stray dog sitting patiently at his feet, its tongue hanging out in a lazy pant. Emily knelt and ruffled its fur. And then this guy happened. The dog thumped its tail against the pavement, looking between them like it understood every word. Maybe it did. After all, it had known the truth before anyone else. James crouched down, running a hand over the dog's scruffy coat. You saved my life, buddy. His voice was thick with emotion. Guess I owe you one. Emily smirked. Oh, you owe him way more than one. The dog let out a single bark, as if to agree. James chuckled, but then his expression softened. But what happens now? He met Emily's eyes. With the case, with everything? She sighed, standing up. Well, Daniel Price and Hastings are both in custody. With Daniel's confession and the evidence linking Hastings to Mark Hensley's death, the case against you is officially falling apart. I'll file for an immediate dismissal of all charges. James swallowed hard. And what about me? After all this, how do I just go back to my life? Emily studied him for a moment, then nudged his shoulder. One step at a time, James. You've been fighting to survive for so long. Now, it's time to start living again. He nodded, but the thought of returning to an empty apartment, to a life that had nearly been stolen from him, left a hollow feeling in his chest. And then he looked down at the dog. The mutt stared back at him, unblinking, like it was waiting for him to figure something out. James reached down and scratched behind its ears. What about you? He murmured. Where do you go now? Emily shrugged. Seems to me like he's already decided. The dog pressed against James's leg, tail wagging. A smile tugged at James's lips. You know, I never had a dog growing up. Emily raised an eyebrow. Well, now's your chance. James hesitated. The thought of responsibility, of taking care of something other than himself, was daunting. But then again, this dog had saved him, had chosen him. Maybe it was time for James to choose something back. He took a deep breath and reached out, scratching under the dog's chin. All right, buddy. What do you think? You want to stick with me? The dog barked just once. But it was enough. Emily grinned. Guess that settles it. James laughed, shaking his head. Guess it does. For the first time in a long time, he felt something other than fear, anger, or exhaustion. He felt hope. As he and the dog walked down the courthouse steps together, he realized that his life wasn't over. It was just beginning. And for the first time, he wasn't facing it alone. The stray dog had walked into his life when he least expected it. And now they were both going home.